Still by Madalena Roscan. The dragonfly stood still, like a stick, strangely attached to the fragments of a Byzantine church window thinned by hundreds of years of sun abuse. Its fragile structure, so carefully molded by millions of years of evolution, translucent and perfectly symmetric, a small helicopter built by nature itself, stood still on the lily pad, transferring shimmer for color with the green, solid, and brutish-looking leaf. The latter seemed to be part of the sky's mirror it laid upon, unmoved, keeping secret the life that exhaled oxygen at every kiss of the sun. And the sun was in a kissing mood that day. All the leaves that breathed were looking consumed and soft, pushing their spines up, abandoning themselves to the sun, with the edges hanging like the arms of lovers, overwhelmed by scorching passion. And while this dance of life, this act of love between the sun and the green mantle of the earth took place, the rest of the elements rested quietly, as in respect for the act of creation. The dragonfly observed in a kaleidoscope of images which amazingly made sense in his dot-sized brain, the stillness of the water around him, its perfect surface unstirred, intermittently flashing with dozens of bright eyes, sending secret messages to the sun. He lifted his front two legs and quickly passed them through the strong jaws. Then, in a symmetric movement, raised them over his bulgy eyes and wiped them all the way down to the mouth. The head rotated on its axis, hideously large and amazingly flexible, making its body look like a fallen lighthouse, with its light almost entirely decapitated, hanging on a thread, but stubbornly attempting to rotate and managing to some extent to do so. Rhythmically, unbothered, he repeated the ritual over and over and then stopped, becoming one with the stillness again. And time passed. And things happened under the surface there, where the secrets are kept. But then, all of a sudden, the air changed. Small sounds sent ripples through the stillness, and life swirled around randomly, filling the air, moving it, dissolving into it. Insects and birds, an explosion of wings and hummings and chirping blew the silence into pieces, and the dragonfly jumped alert on his green support. Without effort, he started moving his wings with the sound that the leaves make when they are bitten by the strong, cold wind of the coming winter, when they are desperately still hanging on the almost empty branches. He lifted higher and higher in dizzy spell movements, following the unwritten rules of instinct, hunting, avoiding, chasing, mating. Finally, he lay on the balustrade of the bridge that crossed the lake. The wood, warm and polished, still smelled like cedar. He could sense its crispy, sweet smell. He turned his body slightly in the direction of the source of the sound and waited. The intruders, two dark shapes now laying in the shade of the willow tree by the side of the lake, were talking softly, humming monotonously like the small engine of a bumblebee. At times the voices were subdued, but lips were talking to one another more silent language, stirring the blood and the senses, the butterflies and the dragonflies in their chests, lifting them to the brain and to the secret places. A brief moment of silence, and the humming began again, sprinkled with giggles and short bursts of laughter. Slowly, nature seemed to embrace the newcomers, absorbing them into its magic, surrounding them lavishly, unselfishly, with its gifts. The dragonfly, though, did not succumb to this apparent calm. Its feet, its wings, its eyes, and something else secretly laying inside him told him that another change was on its way. The wood underneath its thin legs started to vibrate evenly, calling for attention and whispering warnings. Each piece of wood transferred the secret message coming from the side of the bridge, one onto the other, communicating through bolts and screws and nails, pushing into each other, wailing louder and louder at the touch of the slow steps coming in from the other side. The steps were shuffling in an uneven rhythm, stopping at times, in a hurry all of a sudden, and then again slowly, hesitantly. When they stopped, in the middle of the bridge, two hands laid on the balustrade, as wrinkled and as dry as the sunburned wood they rested upon. They grasped the rail with the branch-like fingers, pressing the enlarged nodes on the brown rings drawn on the surface of the dead tree's body. The wood obeyed, fizzling contently when the hand passed gently over its surface, resonating inside and outside the hollow sound of death. The old man followed the dragonfly's trajectory above the lake, then to the right end of the bridge, where large willows bent over the still water. The two dark figures cuddling in the shade caught his eyes, and he remained still, absorbing the newly discovered image. His brown eyes, usually tired and matted, overshadowed by heavy eyelids, shone suddenly, and their light flashed a bright glow that illuminated his whole face. He could not distinguish well the bodies lying on the ground. His old eyes saw only one large, dark shape moving randomly. His hearing, not better than his sight, was not helping him either. But he knew. Just looking and hearing the little that he had, he knew. A small smile lifted the sheets of overlapping skin on his face and the valleys drawn on it. Stillness poured over his body, and the only sign of life was the rhythmic throb in the veins on his neck. The image in front of him morphed. Darkness fell from the sky, and he could see and hear the couple as if he was there next to them. He saw the myriad of stars blinking on the sky's blanket and inhaled the night air soft and fragrant. It smelled like hay. It smelled like summer and love, crickets and sleep. It smelled like her. His heart jumped in his chest and he closed his eyes tight, holding that moment prisoner under his eyelids and in his chest. Bliss, foreverness. He breathed out slowly, afraid, and at the same time he heard his size twin. One opened eyelid later, he had her in front of his eyes. Her face was above his, and he could see her chin, her soft, long neck, and her small nostrils. Her hair was waving around her face and neck, dark and curly, unruly. She was looking away at the lighted houses at the foot of the hill they rested upon. He smiled, feeling all of a sudden her thighs under his head, still and hard on the thin bones. Almost at the same moment, she tilted her head and looked in his face. Her brown eyes, two more stars above him, embraced his face, and his smile resonated naturally on her face. "Did you fall asleep?" she whispered. He closed his eyes again. He had missed her voice, the way she was lisping the S, especially when she whispered. "No," he answered. "Are you sleepy?" she asked. "No," he said. He felt her hand on his face, warm and gentle, and his whole body responded like an arrow pulled in the bow. His senses followed her touch on his cheeks, chin, temples, and forehead. He knew she was looking at him. He knew what she was thinking, what she was feeling, because he felt the same. Blindly, he stretched his arm and took hold of her neck, pulling her towards him. She obeyed and followed his hand until their lips touched. Two chests full of butterflies opened, and their souls sung in a music heard only by them. Her lips were soft and warm, full of life and love, like the pulp of peaches held in the sun, ripe, juicy. She placed her hand on his cheek and whispered, "I wish this night will never end." Tears danced in her eyes, and he passed his hand over them, begging for silence. "Me too," he said. They remained like that, looking into each other's eyes, complete, sad and happy, alone with their thoughts, together in everything else, hoping, praying. He felt a tear on his cheek, and he passed his hand on his face. The rough skin, wrinkled and dry, swished under his calloused hand. Surprised, he looked at his hand, and the sun stared at it too, laughing from its heights at the old man's foolishness. The lines on the old man's face turned horizontal again, and the corners of his mouth fell towards the chin. He looked in the direction of the couple again, and then closed his eyes and tried to conjure the vision again, but to no avail. He sighed and looked away, and then down. His feet under his body, still, looked back at him. Where to now? He turned his back on the willows and the guests at their feet, and looked at the other side of the bridge. The water gently caressed the sands, bouncing its skirts against the bank like a slow, unsuccessful waltz. The scarce grass pushed its sharp tips towards the sun, still. The thin line of the horizon stretched hazily away from the dry land, away from the sun, impartial-like, unable to decide towards whom it should reach. The old man lifted a hand above his eyes and stared at the thin line, perfectly straight and still, like a railway split in half. He followed the line all the way to the left, to the small thicket growing on the left side of the bridge, and then back to the right, to the street slithering alongside the lake. His eyes caught a car moving away, like a cockroach running to the shade, and the coldness embraced him suddenly. The air was cold, and small clouds of steam were born with each exhale he made. The train was pulling in the station, wailing, its brakes screaming metal on metal. For a moment he looked in her eyes, and she looked back at him like a scared deer, frozen, panicked, with eyes swimming in pain. "Forgive me and forget me," he whispered. He couldn't look at her, and kept his pain under his eyelids. She looked at him confused, and then she peered at the woman next to him. There was no hate in her eyes, but just intense confusion and disbelief. It was so hard to see her like that, like an uprooted tree, and half of him pushed into the other half, begging desperately for her. "Don't do this. You love her. She loves you. Don't." But the smile remained still on his face, apologetic. "I know you understand," he whispered again, but the words could still not find a way out of his mouth. "Forgive and forget," his brain repeated. The train whistled, and she jumped, looking sideways at the metal giant behind her. When she looked back at them, he felt how something inside him shattered. Pieces from it stung his eyes and stabbed his ears that filled with a void of sounds. She embraced them with one long look, one more time, and tears sprang on her face. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "I'm sorry, but I can't help myself." "Nor can I," he whispered mutely again. His heart squeezed tight in his chest and the smile on his face stretched painfully. She made one step towards them, and his whole being filled with pain. His arms twitched, ready to receive her between them, but he still did not move. She stretched towards the other woman, embraced her, and managed to say, "I wish you all the best. Take care of each other." She looked one more time at him through a curtain of tears and turned around. He looked a long time at her through the train's window, how she was sitting still, watching away, with that small stream of tears running on her cheek. "Forgive and forget," his mind kept on saying. The train jerked suddenly, and in the same time all his muscles startled in his body, aching for her. "Let's go," the other woman said. He moved away, with his eyes on the train's window, at the small figure crunched in sobs behind it. The heart raced in his chest. "Go after her, don't let her go, go after her." His foot moved, but the pain in it got to his spine and brain, stopping it. The old man looked at his feet, under his body, still, staring back at him. "We can't go there." The old man passed the back of his hand on his forehead and collected the sweat gathered there in small, shiny drops. The horizon hazed in the distance, sucking in the sun that was now getting closer to it. He bent his head and placed it on the warm wood of the balustrade. "Wooden head," he mumbled to himself. "Forgive and forget. But I can't." He placed his forearms on the balustrade and laid his chin on them, looking at the still water beneath the bridge. He stared blindly at the trembling shade looking back at him, and he saw her brown eyes, luminous and warm, looking into his. "I forgive you, but I can't forget you." Her eyes had fine lines under them now, and her skin was thin and pale. Her hands had lost their softness, but her voice was the same. And when she was looking into his eyes, his whole life was pouring into them, finding peace and purpose in all her being. But the sun was going down, and her image dissolved in the darkening water. It was late. Too late, his soul whispered, desolated. The old man stretched back and looked around. In front of him, the horizon was bleeding, pouring purple shadows on the white sand and on the empty blue sky. He turned around, watched the end of the bridge that led to the forest, and then, with his back to the sun, looked at the sleepy trees and bushes and at the birds that were rushing to their nests. The soft light of the evening was calling for rest. He turned more, and he looked at the other end of the bridge. His feet followed his eyes, and they all started slowly towards it, with the same rhythm they had had when he had come. The wood of the bridge cried again, protesting, but Little by little, it became quieter until it stopped altogether. The old man's feet carried him away on the dusty road, lifting small clouds of grey powder at every step. They continued in a straight line for a while, and then they turned right into an alley lined with tall weeds. Dragonflies zoomed in and out, left and right, piercing the sky with short bursts of shimmer. The sun picked one more time at the old man, at the crumbled house remains he was walking through, and then it let itself be swallowed by the dark horizon.